The hit comes in and, oh, right there, you can actually see Vita Vea's tooth that's been knocked out of his mouth. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. This is a first for this channel. We've never really talked about tooth injuries, let alone a clear example of a tooth getting knocked out of a player's mouth, as we can see here with Vita Vea as this tooth goes flying out of his mouth in today's game against the Colts. But management of tooth injuries is actually a really important topic for sports medicine physicians, especially covering things like hockey and to a lesser degree football. The key question with managing something like this for Vea is whether or not the tooth completely came out or if it was just fractured. A lot of people probably wonder, what do I do if I'm playing sports and my tooth gets knocked out? So we're gonna talk about that exact scenario. Unfortunately here, as Vea's coming in, his helmet was lifted up off his face, and so his chin guard is not actually protecting his chin, and the Colts lineman comes in here and just hits him square in the front of the jaw. We can pretty clearly see there this little white fleck floating. That's Vea's tooth right there that looks like it's been knocked out. So you have to presume, at least in this circumstance, that the entire tooth came out in terms of what you really have to think about doing for management. It's a better scenario if the tooth is just fractured than entirely coming out, because that's actually a pretty significant emergency where you want to get it addressed right away. With our biodigital anatomy tool here, we're looking at a cross-section of the tooth to understand the areas that can be injured and what to do about it. Now, the 3 layers of the tooth from outside in are the enamel. This is, of course, this hard kind of outer coating that we see when we look into our mouth. Beneath the enamel is the dentin, and then all the way in the very bottom, that's going to be the pulp. Now then, at the bottom side of the tooth, this area is going to be the root of the tooth. So this area down here, where the tooth receives blood supply, neurovascular supply from these underlying blood vessels that float through the mouth. Some other important things to point out with our teeth here is we have these little periodontal ligaments that actually run to help anchor the tooth securely in the tooth cavity. The most serious type of tooth injury is an avulsion. This is where the entire tooth actually comes out, root and all. And this is a true dental emergency. The longer that the tooth is exposed to the elements and not put back in place, you run the risk of that tooth actually dying. Remember, the blood supply comes up into those roots, and so if you pull the entire tooth out, it has no blood supply and it will quickly die. There's actually a 90% save rate if you're able to reimplant the tooth within 20 minutes. And 60 minutes is the absolute cutoff where it's almost a guarantee the tooth is not going to survive if you can't get it reimplanted within that 1-hour time slot. So if this is in fact the entire tooth that has been knocked out, resulting in a tooth avulsion for Vita Vea, he has basically 60 minutes to save that tooth before it's essentially a guarantee that it's not going to survive. I'll admit it looks pretty small and white here, so hopefully it was just a fracture and not a full avulsion. If you're out on your own playing sports and this happens to you, or your entire tooth gets knocked out, there are some things you can do in the meantime before you get to a dentist. Ideally, you have something called Tooth Saver if your event is being covered by an athletic trainer. Put the tooth in there, get to a dentist as quickly as possible. If you don't have that, skim milk is the next best option, followed by saliva, basically trying to put the tooth back to stored in your mouth on the way to the dentist. Make sure though that you do not touch the exposed root of the tooth, because that's another risk factor for the tooth not surviving. So only touch this top enamel part when you're handling it. The next tooth injury to talk about is a tooth fracture, where the tooth root is still anchored. It's not been displaced one way or the other to injure those periodontal ligaments. It's just a piece of the tooth is broken off, which could certainly also be the case for Vita Vea. For those, it comes down to whether or not there's exposure of the underlying pulp and whether or not the tooth is displaced, meaning there's been damage or injury to these periodontal ligaments. If the pulp is exposed and bleeding, we have different supplies in like a dental emergency kit where you can actually cover that exposed pulp with like a cement to protect it. But then if you have displacement of the tooth with bleeding around the gums, that signifies these periodontal ligaments could be injured. And that's more serious with really actually stabilizing the tooth, almost like you would a fracture. As a good rule of thumb, if your tooth gets hit and you see bleeding kind of right around this area where the tooth inserts into the gum, there's high likelihood that the tooth has been displaced and you should see a dentist and you don't want to go mashing around on it. So that's it for truly a first on this channel talking about tooth injuries. Remember, if your tooth gets knocked out while playing sports, ideally you get it put back in within 20 minutes, but 60 minutes is really the final cutoff. If you have Tooth Saver, put the tooth in there. If you don't, skim milk, saliva, or saline are good options to try to protect the tooth, but avoid touching the root and only handle it by the enamel or the crown. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.